Samuel Mackenzie wiped the sweat from his face as he looked out at his dying ranch. The sun was setting over the barren fields where his cattle used to graze. 2 years ago, this place was full of life. Now it looked like a graveyard. He walked slowly toward his old wooden fence, remembering better days. His boots crunched on the dry grass that hadn't seen rain in months. The drought of 1887 was the worst anyone could remember in Wyoming territory. It had sucked the life out of everything he had worked for. Samuel was only 35, but he felt like an old man. His dark hair was already showing gray, and deep lines had formed around his eyes from squinting against the harsh sun and worry. His hands, once smooth, were now rough and calloused from years of hard work that seemed to lead nowhere. He stopped at the grave marker behind his house. A simple wooden cross with Elizabeth Mackenzie and baby Mackenzie carved into it. His wife had died giving birth 2 years ago, and the baby didn't make it either. That was when everything started falling apart. Elizabeth had been his strength, his reason for getting up every morning. Without her, the ranch felt empty and cold. Samuel knelt down and touched the cross gently. "I don't know what to do anymore, Lizzie," he whispered. "I tried to keep this place going for you, but I'm losing everything." The bank had been patient at first. Mr. Henderson, the banker, knew Samuel was a good man who had just hit hard times. But patience only lasted so long. Last week, Henderson had delivered the final notice. Samuel had until the end of the month to pay what he owed, or they would take the ranch, $300. That's all he had left in the world. It was hidden in a coffee tin under a loose floorboard in his bedroom. $300 against a debt of nearly $2,000. It was hopeless. Samuel stood up and walked back to his house. The roof leaked in 3 places and one of the windows was cracked. He had always planned to fix these things, but there was never enough money. First it was buying feed for the cattle. Then it was paying the doctor bills when Elizabeth got sick. Then it was the funeral costs. The ranch had been bleeding money for 2 years. Inside the house, everything reminded him of Elizabeth. Her sewing basket still sat by the window. Her favorite book was still on the table next to their bed. He couldn't bring himself to move anything. It felt like giving up on her memory. Samuel sat down at his kitchen table, the same table where he and Elizabeth used to plan their future. They had dreamed of having children who would run around the ranch. They had talked about expanding the herd and maybe building a bigger house. All those dreams died with her. He opened the tin and counted the money again, even though he knew exactly how much was there. $300 in worn bills and coins. It wasn't enough to save the ranch, but it was enough to get drunk and forget his troubles for a while. The nearest town was 5 miles away. Samuel rarely went there anymore because people looked at him with pity. Everyone knew about his bad luck. They whispered about the rancher who lost everything. Some folks were kind, but kindness didn't pay debts. As darkness fell, Samuel made a decision. He would ride into town, go to the Red Horse Saloon, and drink until he couldn't think anymore. Maybe he would wake up tomorrow with a clear head and a new plan. Or maybe he wouldn't wake up at all. Right now, he didn't much care which. He saddled his horse, an old mare named Belle, who had been with him for 8 years. She was one of the few things he couldn't bring himself to sell. Belle had carried him and Elizabeth on their first ride together as husband and wife. She had been there through all the good times and bad. "Come on, girl," Samuel said, patting her neck. "Let's go to town. Maybe we'll figure out what comes next." The ride to town gave Samuel time to think, but thinking only made things worse. Every memory led back to Elizabeth or to some failure on the ranch. He had tried everything he could think of. He had sold most of his cattle at a loss. He had taken odd jobs in town when he could find them. He had even swallowed his pride and asked his brother in California for help, but his brother had his own problems. The town was busy for a weeknight. Light spilled out of the saloon windows, and Samuel could hear loud voices and piano music. It sounded like there was some kind of special event going on. He tied Belle to the hitching post and took a deep breath. Samuel had never been much of a drinker, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He pushed through the saloon doors and was hit by a wall of smoke, noise, and the smell of whiskey. The place was packed with cowboys, farmers, and drifters. Everyone seemed to be talking at once. He made his way to the bar and ordered a whiskey. The bartender, a big man with a gray beard, poured the drink and slid it across the wooden bar. Picked an interesting night to come in, Mackenzie," the bartender said. "Haven't seen you around here in months." Samuel nodded and took a sip of his drink. It burned going down, but it felt good. "Yeah, well, I figured it was time for a change of scenery." The bartender leaned closer. "You might want to finish that drink and head home. Things are about to get ugly in here." Samuel was about to ask what he meant when the crowd suddenly got quiet. A man in a fancy suit had stepped onto a small stage at the back of the room. Samuel had never seen anything like what was about to happen, something that would change his life forever and challenge everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. The man in the fancy suit raised his hands to get everyone's attention. Samuel noticed he wore gold rings on several fingers and had a pocket watch chain hanging from his vest. This wasn't a local man. He looked like someone from back east, maybe a traveling businessman or trader. Gentlemen, the man called out in a loud voice. "Tonight we have something very special for you. 3 lovely young ladies who are looking for husbands. They're willing to enter into proper marriage contracts with decent men who can provide for them." Samuel almost choked on his whiskey. Marriage? Contracts? He had heard rumors about such things happening in some of the rougher frontier towns, but he never thought he would see it with his own eyes. The crowd around him started getting excited, men pushing closer to the stage. "Now hold on there," the fancy man continued. "These aren't just any women. Each one has her own story, her own skills, and her own reasons for being here tonight. Let me introduce them to you." Samuel watched in horror as 3 young women were led onto the stage. They looked scared and uncomfortable, their eyes darting around the room full of rough men. None of them wanted to be there. That much was clear from their faces. The first woman was pale with reddish hair tied back in a simple bun. She wore a plain brown dress that had seen better days. Her hands were shaking as she stood there trying to look brave. "This is Margaret O'Sullivan," the man announced. "She's 19 years old, came here from Boston. Margaret can read and write better than most men in this room. She knows how to keep books and manage money. Her whole family died of typhoid fever on the journey west, and she's got nowhere else to go." Margaret's face turned red with embarrassment. Samuel could see tears forming in her eyes, but she held them back. She was trying to maintain what little dignity she had left in this terrible situation. The second woman was slightly older, with blonde hair and strong-looking hands. She stood straighter than the others, like she was used to hard work. Her dress was patched in several places, but it was clean and well-maintained. "Catherine Miller here is 22, the man continued. "She knows all about farming and raising animals. Her husband was killed by bandits 3 months ago, and she lost their farm to creditors. Catherine can milk cows, birth calves, and make the best cheese you ever tasted. She's looking for a man who needs a hard-working wife." Catherine stared straight ahead, not looking at the crowd. Samuel could tell she was angry about being put on display like this, but what choice did she have? A woman alone on the frontier had very few options for survival. The third woman was the youngest. She had dark hair and brown skin, and Samuel guessed she was Mexican or Spanish. She looked terrified, her whole body trembling as she stood on the stage. "And this pretty little thing is Rosa Martinez," the man said with a grin that made Samuel's skin crawl. "She's only 18, speaks both English and Spanish. Rosa here is running away from some family trouble down south. She can cook, clean, and she knows all about the local plants and weather patterns. Very useful skills for a rancher." The crowd was getting rowdier. Men were shouting out comments and questions. Some of the things they said made Samuel feel sick to his stomach. These weren't men looking for wives. They were looking for servants or worse. "Now the bidding starts at $50 for each lady," the fancy man announced. "These are legal marriage contracts, properly witnessed and binding. The winning bidder gets a wife who will honor and obey, just like the good book says." Samuel looked around the room and recognized some of the men who were raising their hands to bid. There was Jake Morrison, who was known for beating his horses and getting drunk every night. There was Pete Williams, who had been thrown out of 2 towns for fighting and stealing. These weren't decent men looking for companions, they were predators looking for victims. $60 for the Irish girl, someone shouted from the back. 75 for the German woman, called out another voice. Samuel watched Margaret's face crumble as the bids got higher. She knew what kind of life awaited her with these men. Catherine clenched her fists, probably thinking about running, but there was nowhere to go. Rosa looked like she might faint from fear. The bidding continued, and Samuel felt anger building inside him like he hadn't felt since Elizabeth died. This was wrong. These women weren't cattle to be sold to the highest bidder. They were human beings who deserved better than this. $80 for all three, shouted a voice that Samuel recognized. It was Tom Brady, a man who had been arrested twice for beating women. The crowd cheered, thinking this was great entertainment. Samuel's hands started shaking, but not from fear. He was furious. He thought about Elizabeth and how she would feel if she could see this. She had always said that a man's character was measured by how he treated people who couldn't protect themselves. The fancy man looked around the room. "Do I hear 90? 95, called out another voice. This time it was Bill Harrison, who lived alone in a shack outside town and was known for his violent temper. Samuel looked at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He saw a broken man who had lost everything that mattered to him. But maybe, just maybe, he could do something right for once. Maybe he could save these three women from a fate worse than death. The clock on the wall showed 11:30. The auction was supposed to end at midnight. Samuel reached into his pocket and felt the money he had brought to drink away his sorrows. $300. His entire life savings. He thought about his ranch, about the debts he couldn't pay, about the future he didn't have. Then he looked at the three women on the stage and made a decision that would change everything. The bidding was at $100 for all three women, and time was running out. Samuel's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it over the noise in the saloon. The clock on the wall showed 11:45. 15 minutes until midnight, and these three women would be sold to men who would treat them like property instead of human beings. He looked at his whiskey glass, still half full, and pushed it away. His mind was clearer now than it had been in months. For the first time since Elizabeth died, he felt like he had a purpose. $110 for all three, shouted Jake Morrison, waving his money in the air. The crowd cheered and whistled. Jake was grinning like he had already won some kind of prize. Samuel stood up slowly from his bar stool. His legs felt shaky, but not from fear. It was from anger and determination mixed together in a way that made his whole body feel electric. 125, called out Pete Williams. He was laughing and making crude jokes with his friends about what he would do with three wives. The fancy man on stage was getting excited too. The higher the bids went, the more money he would make from his cut. Excellent. Do I hear 100D? And 30? Margaret was crying now, tears running down her cheeks. She tried to wipe them away, but more kept coming. Catherine had her arm around Rosa, who looked like she might collapse at any moment. The three women were holding on to each other like they were drowning. Samuel took a deep breath and thought about what Elizabeth would want him to do. She had always been kinder than him, always seeing the good in people and wanting to help. If she were here, she wouldn't hesitate for a second. 135, someone yelled from the corner. The bartender leaned over to Samuel. You should probably leave now, Mackenzie. This is about to get worse. But Samuel wasn't going anywhere. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his money. $300 in crumpled bills and worn coins. Everything he had left in the world. His last chance to pay off even a small part of his debt and maybe keep his ranch for a few more months. He looked at the money in his hands, then looked at the three women on the stage. Margaret had stopped crying and was staring at the crowd with a look of pure terror. Catherine was whispering something to Rosa, probably trying to comfort her. Rosa was shaking so hard that Samuel could see it from across the room. 140, shouted Tom Brady, the man who had been arrested for beating women. The fancy man looked around the room. $140. Going once. Samuel's hands were trembling as he counted his money one more time. He had never made a decision this big in his life, not even when he asked Elizabeth to marry him. This wasn't just about money, this was about doing what was right, even when it cost him everything. "Going twice," the fancy man called out. Samuel stood up and raised his hand, high in the air. His voice came out stronger and louder than he expected. $200. The entire saloon went quiet. Every head turned to look at him. The piano player even stopped playing. Samuel could feel dozens of eyes staring at him in disbelief. The fancy man squinted through the smoke to see who had made such a high bid. "Did someone say 200? I said $200. Samuel repeated, his voice carrying across the silent room. "For all three women." The crowd started murmuring. People were asking each other who this crazy man was and where he got that kind of money. Samuel recognized some of the faces turning toward him. These were men who knew he was the failing rancher who couldn't pay his debts. Jake Morrison started laughing. 200? Mackenzie, you don't have 200 cents, let alone $200. Other men joined in the laughter. They thought it was a joke. The broken-down rancher who was about to lose his land was trying to bid on 3 wives he couldn't afford to feed. "Show us the money," someone shouted from the back. Samuel walked toward the stage, pulling out his bills and coins. He held them up so everyone could see. "I've got it right here." The laughter died down as people realized he was serious. The fancy man's eyes lit up when he saw the real money in Samuel's hands. "Well, well," the man said with a greedy smile. "It looks like we have a serious bidder. $200 is the current bid." But Jake Morrison wasn't giving up. 210. Samuel's heart sank. He only had 300 total, and he was already higher than he had planned to go. But when he looked at the 3 women on the stage, he saw something that changed his mind. They were looking at him with hope in their eyes for the first time all night. Not because they wanted to marry him, but because they could tell he was different from the other men in the room. 250, Samuel called out. The crowd gasped. This was more money than most of them saw in a year. Pete Williams shook his head and stepped back. Tom Brady looked at his own money and realized he couldn't match that bid. 260, Jake Morrison shouted. But Samuel could tell he was running out of money too. Samuel looked at his remaining bills. He had exactly $50 left. If he spent it all, he would have nothing. No money for food, no money for supplies, nothing to help save his ranch. But if he didn't spend it, these 3 women would end up with men who would hurt them. The clock showed 11:55. 5 minutes until midnight. 275. Samuel yelled. Jake Morrison counted his money twice, then threw his hat on the ground in frustration. "I'm out." The fancy man looked around the room. $275. Do I hear more? Nobody else raised their hand. The price was too high for everyone except Samuel, and they all knew he was crazy for spending money he didn't have. Going once, going twice. Samuel closed his eyes and thought about Elizabeth one more time. He could almost hear her voice telling him he was doing the right thing. The clock struck midnight just as the fancy man brought down his gavel. Sold to the gentleman for $275. Samuel had just spent almost everything he had to buy the freedom of 3 complete strangers. The crowd was staring at him like he had lost his mind. Maybe he had. But as he looked at the relief on the faces of Margaret, Catherine, and Rosa, he knew he had made the right choice. Now he just had to figure out what to do next. The ride back to Samuel's ranch was the longest 5 miles of his life. The 3 women sat quietly in the back of the wagon he had borrowed from the livery stable. Nobody spoke during the entire journey. The only sounds were the wheels creaking on the dirt road and Belle's hooves hitting the ground. Samuel kept glancing back at his passengers. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the stars. Catherine had her arm protectively around Rosa, who was still shaking from the night's events. All 3 women looked exhausted and scared. What had he done? Samuel asked himself this question over and over as they traveled through the darkness. He had just spent almost all his money to buy 3 complete strangers. He couldn't even feed himself properly, and now he was responsible for 3 other people. When they finally reached the ranch, Samuel helped the women down from the wagon. In the moonlight, His property looked even worse than usual. The broken fence posts, the sagging roof, the weeds growing everywhere. This wasn't exactly the kind of place where three young women would expect to start their new lives. "This is it," Samuel said awkwardly, gesturing toward his small house. "It's not much, but it's home." The women looked around without saying anything. Samuel could only imagine what they were thinking. They had gone from being auctioned off like cattle to being brought to a rundown ranch in the middle of nowhere. Samuel led them inside and lit a few oil lamps. The house looked even smaller with 4 people in it. There was the main room with the kitchen table, 2 small bedrooms, and not much else. Elizabeth's things were still everywhere, making the space feel crowded and uncomfortable. "I know you must be wondering what happens now," Samuel said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I guess I should explain why I did what I did back there." Margaret spoke for the first time since leaving the saloon. "You saved us from something terrible. We know that much." Her voice was soft but strong. Samuel could tell she was educated, just like the auctioneer had said. Catherine nodded in agreement while Rosa just stared at the floor. Samuel took a deep breath. What he was about to say would sound crazy, but it was the truth. "I want you to know that I didn't buy you to be my wives. I know that's what those contracts say, but I don't care about that." The 3 women looked up at him with surprise. This wasn't what they had expected to hear. "My wife Elizabeth died 2 years ago," Samuel continued. "She was the kindest person I ever knew. If she had been in that saloon tonight, she would have done the same thing I did. She couldn't stand to see people being hurt or taken advantage of." Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out the 3 marriage contracts. The fancy man had handed them over with a warning that Samuel now had 3 mouths to feed and 3 women to keep in line. Samuel had just nodded and taken the papers. Now he placed the contracts on the table in front of the women. Then he did something that shocked all 3 of them. He tore each contract in half, then in half again, until they were just pieces of paper scattered across the table. "You're free," he said simply. "I have $25 left. It's not much, but it's enough to get you stagecoach tickets to wherever you want to go. Denver, San Francisco, back east, anywhere but here." The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret, Catherine, and Rosa stared at the torn pieces of paper like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Catherine was the first to speak. "You're letting us go, just like that?" "Just like that," Samuel confirmed. "No strings attached, no obligations, you don't owe me anything." Rosa finally looked up from the floor. Her English wasn't perfect, but she managed to ask, "Why you do this? You spend all your money for us." Samuel thought about how to explain it. "Because it was the right thing to do. Because my wife would have wanted me to do it. And because everyone deserves a chance to choose their own life." Margaret was studying Samuel's face like she was trying to figure out if he was telling the why truth. "What about you? If you give us money for travel, what will you do?" Samuel shrugged. "I'll figure something out. I always do." But Catherine wasn't satisfied with that answer. "You'll lose your ranch, won't you? That's why you were in the saloon tonight. You're broke." Samuel looked around his small house, at Elizabeth's things still sitting where she had left them. "Yeah, probably. The bank wants their money by the end of the month. I can't pay them." The 3 women looked at each other, having some kind of silent conversation that Samuel couldn't understand. Finally, Margaret leaned forward. "What if we stayed?" she asked. Samuel blinked in surprise. "Stayed? Here?" "Not as your wives," Catherine said quickly, "but as partners. We could work together to save this place." Samuel shook his head. "That's kind of you to offer, but I can't ask you to do that. You've been through enough." But Rosa was nodding enthusiastically. "I know this land. I know where water is, where grass grows best. My family, we had ranch before my uncle, before bad things happen." Margaret stood up and walked around the small room, looking at everything with new eyes. "I worked in my father's shop in Boston before my family got sick. I know about money, about keeping books and making deals with suppliers." Catherine was getting excited too. "And I know animals. My husband and I had 30 head of cattle before he died. I can tell which cows will give the most milk, which bulls will make the best calves. Samuel stared at them. You're serious about this? We don't have anywhere else to go, Margaret said honestly. And you saved us tonight. Maybe we can save you too. Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Hope. These 3 women, who had every reason to run as far away as possible, were offering to help him rebuild his life. It would be hard work, he warned them. Long days, no guarantee we'd succeed. Catherine smiled for the first time since he'd met her. We're not afraid of hard work. Rosa nodded. Is better than being afraid all the time. Margaret sat back down at the table. So what do you say, Samuel Mackenzie? Do you want 3 business partners? Samuel looked around the table at these 3 brave women who had just offered to help a complete stranger save his ranch. Elizabeth would have loved them, he thought. She would have said they were exactly the kind of people worth fighting for. I say let's get started, Samuel replied, and, for the first time in 2 years, he felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. The first week was harder than any of them had expected. Samuel woke up every morning wondering if the 3 women would still be there, or if they had come to their senses and left during the night. But every morning, he found them already awake, and working. Margaret had taken over the kitchen table as her office. She spread out papers and ledgers trying to make sense of Samuel's finances. The numbers were worse than she had feared. Samuel owed money to the bank, the feed store, the blacksmith, and half the businesses in town. We need to talk, she told Samuel after 3 days of going through his records. Sit down. Samuel sat across from her, expecting bad news. Margaret's face was serious as she showed him a list she had made. You owe exactly $2,047, she said. The good news is, I think I can get some of these people to accept payment plans instead of demanding everything at once. Samuel shook his head. Margaret, these folks have been patient with me for 2 years. They're not going to wait any longer. They will if we give them a reason to believe things are going to change, Margaret replied. I've been thinking about this. What if we offered to pay them back with interest, but over time? And what if we could show them we have a real plan to make money? Before Samuel could answer, Catherine came running into the house. Her dress was dirty, and her hair was messy, but she was smiling bigger than Samuel had seen since the night he met her. Samuel, you need to come see this, she said excitedly. They all followed Catherine out to the pasture behind the house. She led them to a spot near the creek where the grass was greener than anywhere else on the property. Look at this soil, Catherine said, kneeling down and grabbing a handful of dirt. It's perfect for growing hay. And see how the water flows here? We could dig channels to irrigate a much bigger area. Rosa nodded enthusiastically. My father, he teach me about water and land. This place, it can grow much food if we do it right. Samuel looked around with new eyes. He had walked past this spot 1,000 times, but he had never really seen what the women were seeing. The potential, the possibilities. There's more, Catherine continued. I talked to your neighbor, Mr. Johnson. He's got 20 cattle he wants to sell cheap because he's getting too old to take care of them. If we bought them and bred them with good bulls, we could double our herd in 2 years. Margaret was already doing math in her head. How much would the cattle cost? $150, Catherine replied. Samuel laughed, but not in a mean way. We don't have $150. We barely have 50. But Margaret was looking at her papers again. What if we borrowed it? From who? Samuel asked. The bank already wants to take my land. Not from the bank, Margaret said with a mysterious smile. From the people in town. Over the next few days, Margaret's plan became clear. Instead of trying to pay back everyone at once, she proposed something different. She wanted to offer shares in the ranch to the people Samuel owed money to. Think about it, she explained to Samuel one evening. Mr. Henderson at the bank, Mr. Wilson at the feed store. All these people know you're honest. They know you've been trying to pay them back. What if instead of cash, we offered them ownership in a profitable ranch? Samuel was skeptical. Why would they want that? Because they believe in you, Margaret said simply. And because I'm going to show them numbers that prove this ranch can make money. Margaret spent the next week preparing a presentation. She calculated how much money they could make from cattle, crops, and even cheese that Catherine could make from cow's milk. She figured out exactly how much it would cost to buy the cattle and improve the irrigation. The day of the big meeting, Samuel was so nervous he could barely eat breakfast. Margaret had invited everyone Samuel owed money to, plus a few other business owners from town. They were all coming to the ranch to hear the plan. "What if they laugh at us?" Samuel asked as they set up chairs in the main room. "Then we'll try something else," Margaret replied calmly. "But I don't think they're going to laugh." She was right. When the men arrived and Margaret started explaining her plan, they listened carefully. She showed them maps of the property, calculations of potential profits, and a timeline for paying everyone back with interest. Mr. Henderson, the banker, asked the hardest questions. "How do we know this isn't just wishful thinking?" Rosa stepped forward. "Because I show you water," she said in her careful English. She led the group outside to the spots where she had found underground streams. "My grandfather, he teach me to read the land. Water here, grass there. This place, it can feed many cows." Catherine demonstrated her knowledge by examining Samuel's existing cattle and pointing out which ones were healthiest and most likely to produce good calves. The men were impressed by how much she knew about breeding and animal care. By the end of the afternoon, 7 men had agreed to become part owners in the ranch instead of demanding immediate payment. They would get their money back plus profits. When the ranch became successful, the transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened faster than anyone expected. Within a month, the new cattle were grazing in improved pastures. Catherine had set up a system for making cheese and butter to sell in town. Rosa had helped them plant crops in areas where Samuel had never thought anything would grow. Margaret kept meticulous records and made sure everyone got regular reports on how their investment was doing. She also handled negotiations with suppliers and buyers, often getting better deals than Samuel had ever managed on his own. The biggest change, though, was in Samuel himself. For the first time since Elizabeth died, he woke up each morning with purpose and hope. The ranch was alive again, full of the sounds of cattle and the voices of people working together toward a common goal. As autumn arrived, Samuel found himself standing in the same spot where he had stood a year ago, looking out at dying fields and wondering if he should just give up. Now he saw healthy cattle grazing on green grass, crops ready for harvest, and a future full of possibilities. Margaret walked up beside him, carrying a ledger book. "We did it," she said simply. "We're going to be profitable this year." Samuel smiled. "We sure did." He paused. "You know, I never asked you why you all decided to stay and help me." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Because you were the first person in a long time who treated us like we mattered, and because sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, not the ones you're born into." That evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, Samuel realized that Elizabeth had been right about something she used to say. Good things happen when good people help each other. He had saved 3 women from a terrible fate, and in return, they had saved him from losing everything that mattered. The ranch was thriving, but more importantly, they had all found something they thought they had lost forever. They had found home.